Hi, everybody. This is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a little bit about Human Chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. In acknowledgement to country, we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we are. We pay respect to the tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate the continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, we welcome Porscia to our platform, and we're going to be discussing raising a child with autism and pathological demand avoidance. Welcome, Porscia. Thank you for coming on Human Chapters.
Thank you for inviting me, Artie. I'm really looking forward to having a chat.
You're welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Porscia.
Yes, well, I'm a couple of things. First of all, I am a mum of two young children. I have a daughter who is almost 6 and a son who is almost 7. And my son Harry was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2. Um, I'm also a corporate lawyer. I've practiced for around 18 years, but I took what ended up being a 3-year career break starting in 2021. And that was all to be a full-time carer, basically to my son, who we started an early intervention therapy program with. It was called ABA therapy. And all of that was done with this goal of trying to get him school ready. So we sort of put all our time and energy into it and tried to get him ready for school, which took place last year. Now we're in 2025, but it took place last year. So he started prep in a mainstream school last year, and that was a huge success. And finally, I'm also an author. I've written a book called The Unlocking: An Autism Story, and it is being published by the Kind Press in February this year. It's a book that's a part pandemic memoir because my son was diagnosed with autism in the middle of the pandemic, but it also shares our journey with his diagnosis and our discovery of this particular profile of autism known as pathological demand avoidance, or PDA, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And also some of the choices that we made around early intervention options and this ABA therapy that we ended up pursuing. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Portia. Tell us about lockdown before Harry's diagnosis. What led to it?
Yeah, so Harry was diagnosed at age 2.5, and it was August 2020 when we received the diagnosis. We were really lucky because we'd started some of the steps towards the diagnosis before hard lockdown hit. And for a bit of background, we're from Melbourne, and as you will know, Artie, we were the most locked down city in the world. I think it was 245 days in total under lockdown orders. So we received this diagnosis during the pandemic, but a lot of the steps were started beforehand, which was why we were able to get it at all, because during that time you sort of couldn't see people face to face, you couldn't do assessments in a physical setting. And we first noticed a lot of the early signs of autism. Well, they were kind of full-blown signs of autism by the time Harry was 1 year old. And they were, a lot of those early markers were what you would expect when you pick up sort of a book about autism. We saw severe self-restricted eating. He developed what is known as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is like a self-restricted eating. It's not due to any kind of dietary requirements, and it's not linked to body image. But Harry these days sort of eats about 8 to 10 different types of food that are brand and flavor specific. So we noticed that at probably 4 months of age when he started being fussy about breastfeeding, and he switched to this strong preference for the bottle and never went back to breastfeeding. And that just continued to be something that, like, every couple of months a new feeding difficulty would arise. So that was probably our very first sign. The other early marker was his separation anxiety, which was really quite extreme. It happened at about 5 months, and his grandparents, who had been babysitting him from the time he was like 2 or 3 weeks old, it was like a light switch. One day he just realized that these were not his parents, and he just refused to be put into their care without like screaming and tantruming and eventually having really quite big meltdowns. But then we saw lots of other kind of more classic signs of autism as well, like language delay. He spoke his first words at age 2. He had really repetitive and fixated play and quite perfectionistic and obsessive compulsive tendencies, which I found to be a real shock when he was just like a 1-year-old child. He'd sort of pick out imperfections in like his clothing or on a piece of fruit. He'd really notice the blemishes. So all of that are sort of the usual signs that you read about in books about autism. But then we sort of had this other pattern of behavior, which we weren't reading about in the books on autism, and we didn't know where it was coming from. And for a while, it caused us a bit of confusion. We thought, well, maybe he's not autistic. Maybe it's something else. There's another explanation. And all the pediatricians we were seeing were slightly kind of thrown by these other behaviors as well. And they ended up being what we realized were the behaviors of pathological demand avoidance. And for listeners who aren't familiar with that, it's a term that was first developed by a London psychologist, Elizabeth Newsom, in the 1980s. And we're really thankful for her, because she has done the majority of the clinical work in this space. And we're now in 2024, but when you Google PDA, the bulk of the high quality kind of scholarly research still stems from the work that Elizabeth Newson did. And in recent times, other experts have picked up on her work and developed and refined it and built up this body of work. But actually, a lot of the more recent work has been through observations of parents and adults with PDA with lived experience who have contributed to forums and support groups, because this is still not a recognised diagnosis or condition. In the UK, you can get a diagnosis of autism with a PDA profile, but as far as I know, there's nowhere else in the world that really officially recognises PDA. So no one holds themselves out to be a PDA expert. A lot of it's just parents, people like myself with, lived experience as carers or PDA individuals who sort of have voluntarily created a body of work to help other people in this situation. So I guess, what is PDA and what does it look like? And I really need to preface all of this discussion by saying I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a pediatrician. I'm not a medical person. I'm a lawyer by background. And most of what I have to say is from my lived experience with my one child who has an autism diagnosis and who I recognise has PDA traits. So there is no clear-cut definition on PDA, but the best way that I can explain it is that it is this anxiety-based need for control or autonomy that's often exhibited by the individual trying to avoid the ordinary demands of everyday living. So in the case of like a young child, which is how I first started noticing these behaviours, there's a cluster of behaviours which I would call like demand avoidant behaviours, and anything to do with self-care sort of falls into that category. So when you're, a 1-year-old child, getting your nappy changed, having your hair washed, getting sunscreen applied, all of these things are done for you, but really they're being done to you, when you're a pretty helpless 1-year-old. And for our son Harry, each one of those steps was met with just extreme resistance. It was like he was hardwired to resist it. It didn't matter if he was like wanting to, about to do something himself. The moment that we stepped in to do it for him, he would just be hardwired to resist it. Um, and these were all things that he perceived as demands. And anything that's a demand, a PDA perceives as being a threat, which I realize doesn't make a lot of sense to neurotypical individuals. But for a child like Harry, a demand is a threat the way I might see someone running at me with a knife as being a threat. And so he fought these things like it was a life or death battle. Um, and kind of anything that was a transition throughout the day. So from the time he woke up to the time he went back to bed, like all the steps that you go through with a child, getting dressed, brushing teeth, getting out of bed, these transitions were all like perceived threats, and he was like locked in this state of life or death battle with us for each of these steps, which was really difficult for us as parents. My husband and I are pretty kind of progressive and modern people, and we wanted to seek his consent, not verbally because he couldn't speak, but we'd be like, hey, should we do a nappy change now? You've, done a poo in your nappy. And we'd wait for sort of the physical body language consent, and we just never get it. Like he would never agree to us doing a nappy change or any of those other things that I've outlined. Um, and so it was a really physical experience to be raising this child. We just have to wrangle him and just get the nappy change, get the nappy change done. Um, so that's, I guess, the demand avoidance bit. And it also extends to physiological needs, like needs that come from within yourself, like eating and sleeping. So bedtime routines, I think, is a really common one that PDA parents just like, there's very little control over. Bedtimes can blow out to sort of 10 or 11 o'clock, even for, a 2 or 3 year old child. But eating, like to this day, that's our greatest challenge. And that's like a need that comes from within himself, but he still fights this demand that comes from within his own body. So I guess that kind of gives a bit of an outline of the demand avoidance side of the behaviors. The other side of the behaviors I think are worth talking about are the controlling, or what you might call equalizing behaviors, which is where the PDA might try and level out the power difference between a child and an adult through trying to take control. And I'll give you an example of that for us. Harry went through one summer where he would not wear shorts. And not only would he refuse to wear shorts, I think he saw them as a bit of a like imperfect pants or broken pants. It kind of offended his perfectionistic streak, so he wouldn't wear shorts. But he also wouldn't let my husband wear shorts. And we had a similar thing with face masks, which you can imagine was a huge problem here in Melbourne with 2 years of lockdowns. And every time you left the house, you were required to wear a face mask. But Harry would not accept face masks around any of us. And, if we tried to wear it and we'd say to him, oh, these are the rules, we got to wear face masks, he wasn't verbal until he was the age of 2, but he would sort of make that sound like, low level grumbling. And if we tried to push through and say, no, these are the rules, like everybody has to wear face masks, then it would escalate, like go up a level. And if you just try to ignore him and continue on wearing the face mask, he would end up like pulling at your clothes or scratching you and trying to climb up your body to like snatch the face mask off. And it would then escalate to a full meltdown. So that's kind of the behavior that we'd see a lot of, where he was trying to control what we were wearing or what we had on our faces. And as a child to a young autistic kid, we had all these appointments with pediatricians and speech therapists and OTs, and he would not allow any of us to wear face masks in these appointments. And within a couple of minutes of the appointment starting, all of these clinicians could see that they were not going to be able to push past Harry and, just take off our face masks and do the appointments. So yeah, that's I guess the controlling or equalizing side of the behaviors. And you put those two together and it's kind of like everything in your day that you need to do with a child becomes this challenge. So hopefully, I hope that kind of paints a bit of a picture.
It does,
Um,
Portia. Okay, do you mind if I ask you a couple of follow-up questions?
yes.
Um, what was it? Okay, wait. Question one is that perception of a demand behavior being a threat. Where does and you said that it seemed like he was hardwired for it, but
Mm.
do we know the cause of it or where it comes from? Um, why it might
Yeah, it's funny because it's not a learned behavior
be?
because if he is picking up these behaviors from observation of adults, like we obviously don't behave in that way. So I really think it's just the wiring in his brain. It perceives these demands as threats, which and it's like an invisible force because I don't see it. And it's taken a while and a lot of research and reading this work from, this UK psychologist, Elizabeth Newsom, to understand that it's anxiety based. It doesn't always look like anxiety. It looks like opposition or defiance. And as he grows older, it looks less like anxiety. It looks more like just a really difficult child who's sometimes even being the behavior can look a bit manipulative as well because now he has really great verbal skills and he'll use all kinds of creative ways to avoid these demands. But I think the more and more I see of it, I can recognize it is him getting to his threshold tolerance level of what kind of demand or threat he can tolerate before it tips over into this. I've heard people describe it as like a fight, flight, or freeze response, which is when he can't handle any more of these demands, and you see it turn into a meltdown, which is one way of that of exhibiting that panic response. But then you also read, we don't have this, but I've read about other PDA kids responding in terms of selective mutism. And that's, I guess, more of a freeze response, or like escaping, like elopement, which is the flight response. So it kind of, when you think about it in terms of fight, flight, and freeze, it kind of, you can sort of match it up to those different responses depending on, the individual, and how they tend to exhibit that panic state. So no, I don't really know where this behavior comes from, but it seems to just come from within him. Like my husband and I have never reacted to, we're not demand avoidant people. My husband may be a bit of a procrastinator when he has tasks he needs to do, but I'm certainly someone who likes to get my tasks out of the way. So when it comes to sort of learning through observation, I don't think he's picked it up from one of us or from anybody close to us. And bear in mind, these were behaviours we were observing in him from before the age of 1, so really, really early on. Um, a nappy change, at the age of 6 months, he started resisting us on it. So I really do think it's something that comes in his DNA. It's in the neurobiology within him.
Yeah. Thank you for responding to that one. My second question is, you've noticed these behaviors, you've got the diagnosis of PDA. What was that like for you and your husband to, I don't know, comprehend it and then sort of even thinking about as parents what your beliefs were in parenting and combining that processing plus the beliefs and then what it was like for Harry.
Yeah, so yes, we got the diagnosis of autism. So we got a diagnosis of autism, not of PDA. You can't
Yeah.
really get that in Australia. We just sort of self-recognize
Mm.
that he displays these features. Um, what was it like? The autism diagnosis for me was a real sense of relief. It sort of gave me an explanation for why the traditional strategies of parenting weren't working for Harry. And it kind of let me feel that it wasn't me. It wasn't me just doing it badly. There was another reason, which was that, the way his brain works and the way he learns is very different to how I, as a neurotypical person, learn things and perceive things. And I had to really I took the approach of really trying to individualize everything for Harry. So I tried to observe him and the way he learned and his preferences. It forced me to really not try and overlay my expectations and everything that I had observed upon him.
Mm.
Um, but the PDA side of things was really confusing because, first of all, it was hard to believe. Like, even as I'm describing these things to you, where a demand is perceived as a threat to his life and body, that sounds unreal. And it was hard for us to grapple with when when we first discovered this term and started reading about it. But what was undeniable was that there was this pattern of behavior that was being described by Elizabeth Newsom, and we fitted into it like someone had written this description about Harry. So that made us really think, okay, like there's more than, it's not just Harry. There's a cohort of kids out there who exhibit this pattern of behavior, and there are other parents experiencing this and crying out for help. And then there are other approaches that these group of parents have been trying that they seem to have found some success with. So it made us realize that it wasn't a once off, although it wasn't well known that there was this other cohort of kids out there that, was similar to Harry. And the more we read up about it, the more we were able to see what was being described as taking place in our house. But then it really required us to recalibrate our expectations of life for ourselves. I have a lot of kind of um, hobbies, which I think now I look at and I think, well, they're quite selfish hobbies. I like rock climbing and skiing, and I at one point was skydiving. I had a lot of goals for myself, and they were all about me. And my husband and I kind of connected on that level because he was this surfer and fly fisher, and he loved the outdoors. And we always thought we're going to have this great adventurous life in the outdoors together, and we're going to raise our kids to be, adventurous people. And actually, we can't do any of that because Harry's got this really restricted way of eating where we have to carry around these 7 or 8 specific brands of food with him. He can't hop on a plane for 6 hours because he can't eat anything that's on a plane. And as a family, we have been on a plane once since his diagnosis, and that's for this 1 hour trip from Melbourne to Hobart, where we realised, that's achievable. We can sort of bring our own snacks onto the plane. He doesn't need to eat a full meal. And when we get to Hobart, we know there'll be a supermarket there where we can buy this one brand of chicken tenders that he eats. But we can't go overseas because we don't know what's stocked in the supermarkets over there. So we've really had to, reassess our goals for ourselves and for our family. And at one point, we thought we were going to do these big backcountry skiing trips together. And we now realize that we can never do that. And I don't say that in a defeatist way. I say that in quite a realistic way. We might be able to go do that ourselves with other people, but we're not doing that together as a family. And I think we're okay with that now, but it was, the initial adjustment period was really hard. It's in some ways we were both really ill prepared to be parents to this special needs child, and particularly this kind of demand avoidance special needs. And we've had to, just put one foot in front of another and find our own way. So it's been a real adjustment. I think that's probably the best way to put it. But we also, as a family, get to celebrate a lot of things that other people don't, because everything is such hard work. So we celebrated the first time Harry ate chocolate because he had never eaten chocolate. And one of the things we find with his avoidant restrictive food intake disorder is that he will look at a new food and he will say, that is yuck. And I'm like, well, you've never seen it before, let alone tasted it. How would you know? But that is the response that we get. And it's part of his rigid thinking patterns. Like if he's never eaten it before, it's yuck. But when he tried chocolate for the first time, it was like, oh, like this isn't too bad. And he doesn't eat all chocolates. He eats certain types. They've got to be really crunchy and crispy. It's like M&Ms and Smarties. He'll eat those, but he wouldn't eat like a Lindt chocolate ball, for example. But still, we celebrated that. It was a success because for me, that's opening his mind to the fact that trying a new food could be tasty, like he could like it, and maybe that will encourage him to try another new food, hopefully a bit healthier than chocolate. But, you know, for us, chocolate was worth celebrating. So we get to celebrate, you know, things that other families don't. And it's a genuine source of joy. And even his little sister, who's, you know, 14 months younger than him, she kind of cheered him on the first time he tried chocolate. And she cheered him on the first time he tried a chicken nugget, because even though he eats chicken tenders, chicken nuggets are a completely different food. And that was like 6 months of work through his therapy to get him to try a chicken nugget. And now he does eat some specific types of chicken nuggets. So yeah, we have a lot to celebrate as well.
That's incredible, Portia. Like I will never understand the magnitude of the changes you've gone through. But as somebody that doesn't have children, that thinks about what would life be like and does it get altered completely? And now listening to you and thinking about your next level, things that you really love to do, but also listening to that acceptance of it's different and it is almost that it is what it is, kind of thing, but it's taken a lot to get there.
It has. And probably one thing I would say is that, you know, there are good days where I feel like I'm very accepting of it. And then there are other days where like I'll look at other people who are going away to Europe or whatever for a family holiday and be like, oh, we can't do that. Like we can't get on a plane for 16 hours. And I'm weak on those days. I get angry about it and I kind of grieve for that. But, you know, overall, I've kind of come around to accept that this is our new reality and we just got to find a way to get as much as we can out of it. And sometimes it means we divide and conquer. Like we've got a younger daughter
Yes.
and she's neurotypical and she's a lot of fun and she's relaxed and very adaptable. And we don't want her to miss out on things. I think this is one of the big things about raising an autistic and a neurotypical child. Like you, they bear a huge burden at an early age, and you try not to. As the parent, you try to be the one to do all of the accommodating and absorb all of the burden so that the neurotypical sibling isn't affected, because you want to preserve the sibling relationship. And you don't want her to grow up and be 16 and be really resentful that she's never been on an overseas holiday. She's never been on a plane for longer than an hour because her brother can't do it. And it does mean like we have taken separate holidays. My husband Paul has taken Tessa on one trip and I've taken Harry on a 2-hour drive into regional Victoria and we've sort of stayed there overnight. And it's not a normal way to holiday, but it works for us and it means that Tessa doesn't have to miss out on things that her friends are getting to do, but also it's not causing detriment to Harry. So we've had to find new ways of doing things. But you know, if you think hard enough and you're creative enough, there's normally a way to do it.
That's what I love about today's world is the creativity, the lateral thinking of how can we bring these experiences to people, adults, children, elderly, doesn't matter, but thinking creatively really, really does help.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk about ABA therapy. Um,
Yep.
Again, who introduced it? Why that specific therapy for Harry? Okay, Portia, we were talking about ABA therapy. Tell us about that.
Mm. Yes, so ABA therapy stands for Applied Behaviour Analysis. It is a form of behaviour therapy that was developed in the 1960s with the aim of teaching language to autistic children and also helping to reduce challenging or severe behaviours. Um, there is a bit of a controversy around it because when it was first developed in the 60s and the first cohort of kids to go through it were in the 70s and 80s, which was obviously a really different time. And attitudes towards autism have changed a lot since then, as have, attitudes to parenting. So, I mean, I was a kid in the 80s and I remember being spanked as a kid, but you wouldn't do that anymore. And I think ABA back then kind of used positive and negative reinforcement. And unfortunately, that negative reinforcement was sometimes physical punishment as well. And that has caused this particular group of now adult autistic people to have had a very traumatic experience with early forms of ABA. That said, like modern ABA is done very differently. It's all positive reinforcement. A lot of it is done in an in-home environment, so it's in a natural environment, not just in a clinician's office. And that's certainly been our experience of it. And it was all built around special interest areas because many autistic kids and adults have special interest areas, which are highly motivating. And so all of this therapy was play-based around Harry's special interest areas. And we found that, well, to take a few steps back, we had tried well, not all of it, but we had tried many of the first line therapies by the time we had received his diagnosis. So we had started his therapies before we had the official autism diagnosis because we could see that he was having, developmental delays. So we'd been seeing speech therapists, occupational therapists, a dietitian. We saw, I think, 3 psychologists. What we were finding was that all of these appointments were sort of 1-hour appointments once a week or once every 2 weeks, and it just wasn't enough for the pervasiveness of his behaviours. We needed something that was many more hours than that each week. We also found that because he had this demand avoidance, every time we were trying to go to this 50-minute appointment, we would have to allow like 2 hours beforehand to get him ready to go, to get him dressed, because that's a demand. Getting dressed is a demand. Getting into the car seat was like a huge demand. And most of the times we had to just manhandle him, put him in the seat, like flip him in against his will. And that was really stressful because we didn't want to be doing things against his will. We didn't want to have these extra steps that we had to do against his will to get to these appointments. And so, one appointment would take up the whole morning. And as a special needs parent, you just had so many appointments to go to. So when we discovered ABA therapy, and ABA is done quite intensively, it's done recommended at between 20 to 40 hours a week, which is like a job basically. But the therapists tended to come to you, they'd come to your home and do it. So that immediately removed this stress we had of trying to get him to some appointment on time. They would be coming to us, walk through the door and, resume, commence the therapy session in his setting, like in a place where he was comfortable. So that was probably one of the main drivers behind why we chose ABA, the intensity of the hours. It made us believe that maybe with that kind of continual presence and repetition, we would be able to get some progress. But also there was a lot of scientific data to back up the effectiveness of ABA therapy. So having tried all of this sort of first line mainstream therapies and not seen an impact, it sort of just made sense for us to give ABA a go. We were a little bit worried because at the heart of ABA, it's a demand and consequence approach. And so here we come back to this demand avoidance PDA behavior. And we thought, how is this going to work? Like at the heart of ABA, they are asking him to do things in order to teach him new skills. And yet he's demand avoidant. Is this just going to flare it up and make it worse? And actually, I did a lot of research on the parenting forums on PDA online. And a lot of those forums were saying ABA won't work because it is all demand based and you're going to end up doing more harm than helping him. But what we actually found when we spoke to the ABA therapist and explained that we believed he was pathologically demand avoidant was that our therapists were really open to listening to us and hearing what we were saying and describing about him. I'm not sure that they had heard of PDA before, but they were genuinely respectful of his preferences and his neurobiology. And when we said, for him, the highest prize, like the greatest reward you could ever give him, is to give him control. And they said, okay, we can try and shape the therapy to give him back a sense of control. So with PDA, quite often you hear that the usual strategies for autism that are used to help autistic children won't work for PDA because all of that's around routine and structure and consistency and sameness. And for a PDA kid, that kind of structure and sameness can end up amplifying a demand. Like not only is it a demand, but it's going to be a demand that's going to happen at 9 o'clock every day that I have to get out of bed. Like that kind of routine can really heighten the perception of demand. And so the ABA therapists sort of tried to use this desensitization approach where they would just introduce him to bite-sized pieces of demands. So one of the problems we were experiencing with Harry was that during the lockdown, he started refusing wearing shoes, and he did not wear shoes for 9 months. If we approached him with a pair of shoes, he would start screaming and have a full meltdown. And so we asked his therapists, and I use this as an example because it's a really good way of painting a picture of how ABA worked. We asked his therapist to help us with teaching him to wear shoes again. And they broke down this insurmountable challenge into these tiny little bite-sized pieces. And they said, oh, can you just touch the shoe? And then the next day it was put your foot in the shoe for 1 second, and then put your foot in the shoe for 2 seconds. And then the next day was take 2 steps. So it was like really bite-sized increments. It wasn't just wear the shoes and go out of the house and you'll get rewarded for it. It was kind of this really fun game of just touch the shoe and like stick your foot in and take it back out again. And they turned it into a real game for him. But also they offered him a reward. And one of the quirks about PDA is that a reward itself can seem like a demand. It amplifies the expectation that you're going to do something and you won't get this reward until you do this thing. So the way that ABA therapists tried to tweak it was that they gave him a choice of rewards. So he had a special interest in the Avengers. He loved the Incredible Hulk and Spider-Man. He also really loved Toy Story and the Toy Story characters. So Buzz Lightyear and Jessie Cowgirl were sort of really big interests for him. And so they would set up the rewards where it wasn't just you will get to play with this Incredible Hulk toy if you step your foot into the shoe. It would be you can choose to play with this Incredible Hulk toy, or you can choose to play with this Buzz Lightyear toy for 15 minutes if you just step your foot into the shoe for 1 second. And giving him back that sense of control by having a choice of rewards. So it's not like an expectation at the end of it, but like this choice he gets to make at the end of it. So they really tried to honor his particular presentation of autism and this need he had to be in control or get back a sense of autonomy by giving him choices at every step of the process. And even when they came into the house and they'd set up this visual schedule for what the tasks were that they were going to try and run him through that day and what they were going to try and teach him, they would get him involved in putting together the visual schedule. So it'd be like, oh, do you want to play Lego first, or do you want to do your shoe program first? Or do you want to do your puzzles first, your puzzles next, or do you want to kick a ball next? And so he would be involved and get a say. And they'd kind of limit the choices. They'd give him a selection of 3 choices in one go, because otherwise he'd, end up procrastinating and avoiding putting the visual schedule together. But if you limited the choices to 2 or 3 things, he would be able to do it. And all of this took a lot of practice. Like it's not like the ABA therapist came in and achieved this on the first day. But, over time, the more they observed of him and built rapport and understood and saw more of his character, the more they were able to build his preferences into his therapy. And one of the key things with PDA is that the way you present a demand can really make a difference. So if they said something to him like, okay, now we have to pack up all the Lego blocks, that would be like, that's a real demand. Like that sounds like a demand even to me. So the therapist would try and be really creative. They'd do things like, I wonder who can pack up the Lego box the fastest. Like, let's have a race and do this. Or, who can pack up the Lego blocks the quietest? Because they were trying to teach him not to be destructive and not to throw things around the room. And so they would kind of, there was a lot of, I wonder, or let's have a race and see who can do this first. And they were really creative about how they approached his instructions, and they kind of used, I guess, declarative language rather than imperative language, and tried to be collaborative in the instructions that they were giving him. So it was very much like, let's do this together, or let's see who can do this first, or, let's see who can build the best bridge or the best tunnel. And just avoided trying to have that direct instruction to him, which I think he would find really offensive and really triggering. So they were definitely, we found our experience of ABA was that they absorbed all of these observations about him and then tried to build a program that was really very palatable, even for his demand avoidant profile. And look, ABA is not a quick fix. It's a long game. We did early intervention ABA for 3 years, and we still even do a little bit of ABA now, greatly reduced, sort of 6 hours a week, dropping to 4 hours a week this year. But when we first were doing it, we were doing it with this goal of trying to get him school ready. So we hit it really hard, and he had a great time doing it. I should really stress that point, like, because it was all built around his special interest areas and the rewards were all these things that he wanted, he was highly motivated. Like, he would run to the door when the doorbell rang because he knew his therapists were coming, and he wanted to see what toys that they had brought with him and what games they were going to play. And he loved the fact that he was getting this one-on-one attention from his therapists for 3 hours, whereas if he was trying to get attention from Paul or I, we were these tired parents. We were burnt out. We didn't have the energy to engage in this high energy, play with him for 3 hours. And we had a daughter to look after as well. So he actually really loved his ABA experience and has got great rapport with most of his therapists. But we did it for 3 hours and he went to school. We did it for 3 years and he went to school at the end of that. And he had an incredible school experience. He never once tried to avoid going to school, never chucked a sickie, talks about his teachers so fondly, and has friends at school, like incredible friendships. And when we took him trick-or-treating, because he goes to a school in our neighbourhood, so most of the kids that go to school live in our neighbourhood. We took him trick-or-treating for Halloween, and he just knew everyone. He was calling out to his classmates across the street and kids in grade 5 that he knew the names of, and they were waving at him. They're like, "Hi, Harry, hi, Harry." I was like, "How do you know everyone?" And it was because he threw himself into school. He loved it, and he had all the skills. He learned all the skills he needed to have a successful school experience. And we are so grateful that we did ABA, because I don't know how else we would have managed to achieve that. At one point, before we started the ABA process. At one point, we were talking about whether we would homeschool him,
Mm.
like whether one of us needed to be prepared to go down that path, because a lot of the modern literature on PDA talks about the fact that about 70% of these kids have got extreme difficulty with the educational setting, mainstream education, and are either being homeschooled or unschooled or are going to school on sort of modified schooling arrangements, like part-time school hours. And certainly when we were first doing kindergarten, like 3-year-old and 4-year-old kinder, we were doing it on part-time hours, and he was attending the kindergarten with his ABA therapists. And for the first 2 years, even that was really challenging. He would need to leave halfway through the day. He could never stay on at kinder if his therapists left. Um, and so even like the first 2 years of kinder, we're like, oh, can we do it? Can we get him to school? Will it need to be part-time schooling? Will I need to be his integration aide? So we were always questioning that. But at the end of 3 years, it kind of all came together, and he was ready, he was ready to go to school, and he had a great experience there all last year. So it ended up being this huge relief, once he started school.
Um, Portia, I'd love to ask you, actually, now there are three questions.
Okay. Fire
The
away.
first one is you talked about declarative language, and
Mm.
not imperative language. What is the difference between the two, from your
Yeah.
end? And yeah, why declarative?
Yeah. So from my end, there's not much of a difference. But from Harry's end,
Mm,
there's a huge difference. So the difference is the directness of the
mm,
language. Um, when you give an instruction to a PDA kid, and that in itself is a demand, it amplifies the demand more if you sound authoritative and if you are like a, a higher level of power giving the instruction down to a small child. So if I say to Harry, pick up your rubbish and put it in the bin, that is a direction that like is really triggering to him. But
mm,
if I talk aloud to myself and in like an imperative type of declaration, I say, oh, it's not great to just chuck rubbish on the ground. We should really put it in the bin where it belongs so that it doesn't fall
mm,
into the river and the waterways and kill, the birds and fish or whatever. And I'm just having a conversation to myself. He's listening. He's listening the whole time and he's absorbing all of this, but it's not offensive to him because it's not directed at him, and it's not this authority figure telling him to do something. And this is one of the things that's very common, and is commonly reported amongst PDA children. It's the directness of the command or the instruction that's offensive. Um, and we kind of have now adopted it as a more normal way of how we speak,
mm.
that we kind of talk out loud to ourselves things that are a good idea. Like, oh, I wonder if we should go to the playground today. Because even something that's really pleasurable for him, like going to the playground, if I say to him, Harry, we're going to the playground, it doesn't sound like he has a choice. And once the choice is taken away, it feels like a demand. So yeah, it's funny, but we've adopted a way of kind of speaking our thoughts out loud and sort of arguing the pros and cons of it out loud for Harry to hear. And that is a lot more palatable to his PDA profile than
Yeah.
just being told what he's going to do. And over time, because he started to accept demands a bit more with
Yeah.
practice, you can sort of fade out a bit. So
Mm,
when he gets to a school setting, his teacher generally doesn't talk like that, but
yeah.
he's had practice in the home setting
Yeah.
and he's able to sort of adapt to it more in a school setting. Um, and I also think in a home environment, he expects more from us as his parents. He's prepared to put up with sort of slightly different ways of doing things outside of home. But yeah, we found that to be a really kind of effective way of reframing the same demand, packaging it differently and presenting it in a way that was palatable to him.
It's so interesting, Portia, because my speech pathology brain is going into an instruction which is direct, carries less words. And I'm thinking about the child's capacity for
Yeah,
absorbing that language, right? To
yeah.
you then almost using a think aloud. And so that idea of a think aloud being, oh, you're talking it through, not directing it
Lots
through.
of language.
Yes, yes. And going a lot more words come with it, a lot more clauses come with it. That even that idea of the rubbish reaches somewhere else. If it's not put in the bin or it's not put in the right place. Um,
Mhm.
But again, that's another thing we would use for language development in that same breath to go direct, but no, they need to be building language too. But thinking about it's more about when it's directed to him and it
Yeah,
becomes that demand and the power shift from adult to
yeah.
child.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for that. And you've partly answered this, but the segue into him being adaptable to a school setting. Now, a school
Mm.
setting has a routine. The teacher has direct instructions. The what was that like for him when he first started?
So his first experience of an educational setting was 3-year-old kinder.
Yeah.
That was hard. That was so he started 3-year-old kinder during our second year of doing ABA.
Mm.
And his separation anxiety was still extreme at that point. So one of the reasons why I quit my job for 3 years to do ABA therapy with him, and ABA is done one-on-one between the therapist and the child. A parent doesn't usually have to be involved. But because his separation anxiety was so severe, I had to be in the room and actively participating alongside him in order for him to stay engaged with the therapist. So sometimes that meant if the therapist says, can you like group all the red blocks together in one corner and the yellow blocks in the other? I had to do that with him. And sometimes I would have to hold his hand and walk around the house because he felt threatened if I wasn't in close proximity. So um, when we then started 3-year-old kinder, and he was almost 4 at the time when we did that, the separation anxiety was still bad. And the lucky thing was that by then he had built really great rapport with his ABA therapists. So they attended kinder with him as an integration aid. And he went sort of on part-time hours. He attended half of the time and left halfway through the day with his therapist, which meant he still had a lot of time to do therapy in home, but he also had exposure to a bit of the school environment or an educational environment with the therapist in there. Um, so look, that was really hard because then when we ticked over into 4-year-old kinder, his therapist said, let's try and get him ready for school by phasing out the therapist being there the whole time. So for the first 2 terms, the therapist was there with him the whole time and they would leave halfway through the day together. Then in term 3, we tried to stretch it out a bit. We tried to get him to do 15 minutes on his own. So the therapist would be there for the whole morning, then they'd have their lunch break, and then she would try and leave and have Harry there at kinder on his own, but with all the other kids and with the kinder teachers. And the first couple of times that happened, he was hysterical. His kinder teacher had to physically restrain him from running out the door and across the car park to where his therapist had just driven away. And we had timed it so that I would be there 15 minutes later to pick him up. But when I first saw this unfolding, I thought, my goodness, we're not going to be able to get him to school next year. Or at least we wouldn't be able to get him to do that independently next year. But one of the things we found was that with the PDA brain, many kids with PDA tend to be really creative and good at role play. And so we tried to build that into his school or his educational experience. And he was really into Harry Potter at the time. So we started kind of getting him dressed up as Harry Potter to go to school. And we would talk to him not as Harry, my son, but as Harry Potter. And we would talk about going to kinder as like going to Hogwarts. And we would give him this little wand to carry that lit up on the end when he kind of flicked it. And it was like this kind of novelty, and created a bit of a make-believe world where he could kind of perform these tasks through an alter ego. It wasn't really him doing it. He was being Harry Potter. And so he ended up being able to go to kinder without an aid because he was going as Harry Potter, and he was flying in on a broomstick. And this literally happened. He rode his broomstick into kinder, and his teachers would greet him at the door and be like, "Oh, Harry Potter's here today." He would sometimes even call his teachers Professor McGonagall or Professor Dumbledore. But yeah, one of the things we discovered about PDA kids is that they are really good at role play, and if you're creative about how you use it, you can use role play to help the child fulfill demands and comply with structure and routine that would otherwise be really difficult. And sometimes he would use role play to get out of doing things he didn't want to. This didn't happen to us, but you hear other PDA kids, other PDA parents talk about their kids saying, "Oh, I can't walk because today I'm a mermaid, and mermaids don't have legs, so they can't walk." That's a really quite typical PDA thing that comes out of their mouths. But Harry would say things like, "Oh, I can't put rubbish in the bin today," except if you got him to do it in character, he could do it because it wasn't him putting something in the bin, it was Harry Potter. And somehow that is less offensive to him as an individual when he's doing it in character and in role play. So how we got him to school was through this use of role play. And then once he got used to it, we found that the role play was able to be dropped away. So now he goes to school, he goes to prep. Well, he'll be starting grade 1 this year. And we don't need to go through this whole elaborate thing. He gets dressed in his school uniform, and I talk to him as my son, but that's because he's comfortable with it now, and he's been desensitized to that initial experience of going to a new setting that was really scary, which was school. And now that's part of a routine that he has accepted, and he doesn't see it as a demand because he's used to it now. But yeah, certainly those first 2 years at kinder were extremely difficult. And we had incredible kinder teachers who listened to us and listened to his ABA therapists who knew him really well by that point. And they really tried to, do the things that we told them would work, like role play, like using declarative language, like not giving, like giving choices to him rather than just instructions. And it meant that overall he had a really successful outcome at kinder, despite it being, a huge challenge to start with.
Wow. It's just I'm in awe of how much thought needs to go into
So much.
how like just the intricate nature of it. And these are things you otherwise wouldn't even consider or think
No.
about.
No,
Um,
and it really shaped our choices around which kinder to send him to and what school to send him to. Because we chose places that were really small. We met with all of the key people beforehand, and we met with other places too and thought, no, that person's not really listening to us when we're talking about PDA. I don't think they're going to take on board what we're saying. They've got some pretty set views about how schooling should work, and I don't think they're going to accommodate Harry. And so we just had to rule out a few of those places. But when we found the right people who were willing to listen to us and were open-minded in terms of what we were describing about pathological demand avoidance, and small settings tended to help a lot as well, because it meant that they had time to sort of give towards his particular preferences.
Mm.
We always chose small kinders and small schools. Yeah, we found that it was possible to do with a lot of hard work from everyone, and you are asking for them to make a lot of accommodations. But it's fulfilling for them as professionals as well, for them as teachers to start the year with a kid that could not be left alone without their aid, and then finish a year with a kid who could and is then ready to start prep the following year is, professionally very fulfilling for them as well, I hope. But they put in an incredible amount of hard work. It wasn't just us as parents, it was them as professionals, as teachers and therapists and, principals who listened and took on board all of these suggestions that we had. And part of why I wrote this book was really to shed light on how much goes on behind the scenes. Parents obviously give a lot to it, but all these other people, these team of therapists we had, and I refer to them as Team Harry because there's so many people involved. Um, but they poured, their dedication and time into understanding him
Mm.
and designing something that would work specifically for him. And I think that personalized approach in modern ABA, like modern best practice, neurodiversity affirming ABA, really takes that personalized approach to the individual. There's no one size fits all. It's about rapport building and understanding the child that they're working with. And we were lucky to, have an incredible team.
Yeah. Portia, thank you so much. We've covered wide ground in this conversation. Is there anything that you would have wanted to share that I didn't ask you about in terms of this specific chapter?
I think probably the one point I want to drive home is that this experience that I've been through has really been a case of trial and error. And in a 1 hour podcast, you don't get to talk about all the things that go wrong before you find the one that, is right. So I would really say if there are parents who are in a similar situation listening to this, I would say expect your journey to have a lot of roadblocks and for a lot of things to not work out. Um, but just kind of try and not let yourself get beat up by the fact that something that you've tried and you've hung your hopes on
Mm.
is not the right fit, like it's not the right therapy or you haven't got the right therapist. It's something that all of us families with autistic children go through and it's part of the journey. But on the flip side, like be open-minded and give everything that sounds like a reasonable option at least the time of day, like hear it out, do your research and think about whether it could work for your child. Even if you are hearing parts of the community saying, oh, that could never work, it didn't work for us, or, my son or my daughter really hated it and it was really traumatic, I think you really need to at least open your mind to try and learn about it and think about how it might work for your particular child because he or she is so different to every other child out there. Um, and also not be afraid to give things a go and have it fail. That doesn't mean you've done something harmful. It just means that you've tried. Um, and if you're an involved parent, I don't think you need to worry that you will make a wrong move and it will end up being harmful for your child. Like you will see, like you keep assessing and gauging the effectiveness of the therapy that you've chosen and making decisions based on the feedback that you're getting from the child. And I think, that's probably the point that I'll drive home. There's no clear-cut path, but, be prepared for this journey of trial and error.
Thank you so much, Portia. I'm going to have the link to your book in the show notes, and even where to find you, because if anybody does want to connect with you at some stage, then they can have it there.
Yes, that
Yeah.
would be lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a website, and I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so I'll share that with you. And yeah, look, I love connecting with other parents, and since I've disclose that I've written this book, I've had so many people reach out from all different corners of the world to sort of, share their experiences. And that's been a really rewarding part of what I've, experienced. So thank you for having me on, Artie. I really enjoyed having this chat with you and being able to, share my story with other interested listeners.
Oh, you are so welcome. And for our listeners, Human Chapters is available on YouTube, podcast, and Facebook. And this conversation, yeah, has been incredible. But please share it with others. We don't know